It is too steep, if you do not turn back now. The mountain will claim you. The voice was like grinding stone, low and resonant, echoing against the jagged rock face as the blizzard swallowed the world whole. Genevieve collapsed into snowbank, her breath coming in ragged. Freezing gasps. She did not know who stood over her, only that the massive, dark shape silhouetted against the swirling white abyss was the only thing preventing her from becoming a permanent part of the drift. But the truth was far more complicated than anyone imagined. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you are watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. She was a woman exception stature, her muscles thick and corded from a life of unrelenting labor. Yet now she felt small, brittle, and utterly spent. Her fingers, raw and numb by the biting frost, dug in the eye crust as she tried to force her giant frame to rise. It was a futile effort. She felt the heavy, calloused hand of the stranger grip her arm, his strength so absolute that he hoisted her upward as if she possessed no weight at all. "I cannot turn back," she managed to gasp, her voice barely a whisper against the howling gale. "There is nothing left for me down there." The man did not reply. He hauled her against his chest, a wall of living, breathing heat that defied the sub-zero air. It was a mountain of a man, his frame broad enough to anchor a house, covered in furs that smelled of pine needles and damp earth. He did not offer pity, he offered movement. With long, deliberate strides, he pushed into the whiteout, his giant frame cutting a path through the drifts with the steady rhythm of a man who belonged to the storm. Genevieve leaned into him, her head resting against his buckskin-clad shoulder. Every instinct she possessed screamed for her to pull away, to rely only on her own iron resolve. Yet the exhaustion was a tidal wave. She was a woman who had spent her entire existence being told she was too big, too strong, too much. Now, she was simply a survivor being carried in the unknown by a protector who did not care about the size of her shadow. They reached a structure that seemed hewn from the very mountain itself. It was a cabin of thick, weathered logs, nestled in a natural crevice that protected it from the prevailing winds. The man shoved the heavy door open with a kick of his boot and stepped inside, the sudden silence of the interior ringing in Genevieve's ears like a bell. He dropped her gently onto a pile of heavy wool blankets near a stone hearth, where the dying embers of a fire still pulsed with a dull, orange glow. He moved away then, silent and efficient, tended to the fire with hands that were steady despite the cold. Genevieve watched him through the haze of her fatigue. He was a man out of time, his hair long and matted, his beard thick with frost that began to melt into droplets as the room warmed. He was a creature of solitude, a ghost of the high ridges who had clearly forgotten the language of human company. He turned toward her, his eyes deep, shadowed pits that held an intensity which made her breath hitch. He did not ask her name. He did not ask why a woman of her size was wandering the high passes in the middle of a killing blizzard. He simply placed a heavy iron mug of steaming liquid near her hand and retreated to the shadows of the corner, settling on a bench with the patience of an old tree. "The wind will howl for 2 days," he rumbled, his voice barely audible over the crackling flames. "You are safe until it breaks. After that, you must leave." Genevieve clutched the mug, the warmth seeping in her frozen palms. She had traveled 300 miles to escape the eyes of those who feared her strength, to find a place where she would not be a spectacle or a tool for others to use. She had not expected to find a man who matched her own physical reality, a man whose presence made her feel, for the first time in her life, not like a giant, but like a person. "I have nowhere to go," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the fire. He did not look at her. Yet she saw his massive shoulders stiffen. The mountain does not care about your stories. It only cares if you can survive. He closed his eyes then, and the cabin returned to a state of absolute, heavy silence. Genevieve lay back, the ache in her limbs subsiding into dull throb. She watched the firelight play across the logs, wondering if this was to be her final resting place, or if the man in the corner would be the one to seal her fate. The wind roared against the walls, a beast trying to claw its way inside. But for the first time in years, the fear that had been her constant companion began to retreat. She looked at the man again, noting the way his muscles rippled even in stillness, the way he occupied his space with a quiet, terrifying grace. She realized then that he was as trapped by this mountain as she was by her past. The loop of her survival had closed for the night. But the question of why a man would choose 8 years of such profound isolation hung in the air like smoke. She closed her eyes, listening to the rhythmic, heavy sound of his breathing, wondering what scars he hid beneath those layers of fur and silence. The storm continued its assault, but inside the cabin, the embers grew brighter. She was no longer running, but she was far from safe. The man in the corner stirred, his hand resting on the hilt of a knife he had not drawn, his gaze fixed on the door as if he expected it to burst open at any second. Who was he protecting him from? And why did he look at her as if she were a ghost from a life he had buried long ago? The morning light did not arrive so much as it bled through the chinks in the cabin logs, a pale, sickly gray that offered no warmth. Genevieve stirred, the ache in her muscles a constant reminder of the miles she had traversed to escape the life that had tried to break her. She remained motionless for a long moment, allowing her eyes to adjust to the dim interior. The cabin was a singular room, Spartan and functional, dominated by the massive stone hearth and a workbench covered in tools that had seen decades of hard use. Barnaby was not in the corner. She sat up, the heavy wool blankets sliding from her shoulders. Her movements were deliberate, tested by the years she had spent ensuring she did not break the fragile world around her. She was a woman built for heavy lifting, for the toil of fields and the crushing weight of expectation. Yet here, her presence seemed to dwarf the furniture. She rose, her height nearly brushing the rafters, and stepped toward the hearth. The fire had been stoked, the embers buried under a layer of ash to keep the heat lingering, and a cast iron kettle simmered on the grate. The door creaked open, admitting a blast of frigid air that rattled the rafters. Barnaby stepped inside, his presence filling the threshold. He carried a bundle of firewood that would have strained the back of an ordinary man. But for him, it seemed a light burden. He stood there for a height, his eyes scanning the room, landing on her with a detached, analytical precision. He did not speak, but he moved to the corner and deposited the wood with a dull, heavy thud. "You are awake," he murmured, his voice lacking any inflection. "I am," she replied, her own voice steady, though it felt strange to hear it in the quiet. "I have not thanked you for the shelter." He turned away from her, Bessieing him with the sharpening of a draw-knife. The rhythmic scrape of metal against stone was the only sound in the room. "The mountain would have taken you. It is a waste of life to let it. That is all." Genevieve walked toward the window, looking out at the world of white that remained trapped in the grip of the storm. The drifts were high, blocking the world she had fled. "You live here alone. By choice?" He paused, the knife hovering over the wood. "There is no noise here. No expectation. Only the work." He spoke with a finality that discouraged further inquiry. Yet Genevieve sensed the deliberate construction of his solitude. He was not a man who had been cast out, He was a man who had retreated, carving out a fortress of stone and wood to keep the rest of the world at bay. She wondered what weight he carried on those broad, corded shoulders. What phantom regrets kept him tethered to the high ridges. She moved to the kitchen area, her large, calloused hands finding the simple tools. She began to prepare a meal, her movements fluid in practice. She did not ask for permission. She simply integrated hers in the rhythm of the space. She found dried meat and root vegetables tucked away in a cool cellar beneath the floorboards. As she worked, she could feel his eyes on her back. It was not a predatory gaze, but one of profound curiosity, as if he were studying a puzzle he had not expected to encounter. "You know your way around a kitchen," he finally said, his voice softer than before. "I have spent my life doing for others," she replied, not turning around. "It is the only way I know how to be." He stood and walked to the table, his heavy boots striking the floorboards with a force that made the room vibrate. He watched her plate the meal, his gaze dropping to her hands, which were scarred and strong, capable of crushing stone or tending a child. He seemed to recognize the same lines of hardship etched into her skin that he bore upon his own. They ate in silence. The only connection between them, the shared knowledge of their physical reality. In a world of smaller, more fragile people, they were anomalies. Giants of bone and muscle who had navigated a lifetime of feeling like invaders in their own lives. For the first time, Genevieve did not feel the need to shrink, to hunch her shoulders, or to apologize for the space she occupied. "The storm will break by nightfall," Barnaby said, his gaze fixed on his plate. "The pass will be clear by morning." It was a warning. The grace period of her arrival was reaching its end, and the reality of her uncertain future was pressing back into the room. "I have no destination," Genevieve confessed, her voice barely a whisper. Barnaby looked up, his eyes searching hers, looking for the lie, the hidden agenda, the reason she would seek out the most inhospitable place on earth. He found only the raw, exposed truth of a woman who was tired of being a spectacle. "The mountain does not suffer fools," he said, his voice rough. "If you stay, you work. You do not talk, and you not ask about the years before." He stood and walked to the door, his silhouette immense against the dying light of the afternoon. He did not wait for an answer. He exited in the biting cold, leaving her alone with the fire and the realization that she had just been offered a reprieve that came with a price she did not yet understand. She looked at the empty seat he had occupied, the space still warm from his presence. The loop of her survival had been extended, but she knew that the calm was temporary. The mountain held secrets, and as the wind began to die down, she felt the unmistakable sensation that the world she had run from was not as far behind her as she had hoped. If she stayed, would she be safe from the people who hunt her, or would she only be trading one form of imprisonment for another? The morning did not bring sunlight, but rather a brittle, blinding clarity. The blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving the world encased in a layer of crystalline ice that caught the light and shattered it into 1,000 stinging needles. Genevieve emerged from the cabin to find the air so cold it felt like inhaling iron. Yet her lungs expanded with a sensation of sharp, clean purpose. Barnaby was already at the woodpile. He swung his heavy axe with a rhythmic, hypnotic precision, the blade biting deep in the seasoned timber. Each strike was a testament to his sheer physical power. His muscles bunching and releasing beat the fabric of his shirt like coiled steel cables. He did not acknowledge her arrival, yet he moved to give her space, adjusting his rhythm to accommodate her presence. "The wood must be split and stacked before the next front arrives," he muttered, his voice barely rising above the whistle of the wind through the pines. Genevieve did not hesitate. She picked up a smaller, Iron-headed Maul rested against the stump. She began to work in tandem with him, her motions echoing his own. She was built for this, for the raw, unadorned exertion that required no apology. There was the profound, wordless satisfaction in the labor, a grounding of her spirit that she had never known in the lowlands where her strength was viewed with suspicion or demand. They worked for hours, the air warming only slight as the sun climbed behind the jagged peaks. Their movements became a synchronized dance of giants. When a log proved too stubborn, Barnaby would step in, his massive hands gripping the wood as if it were a twig, holding it steady while Genevieve drove the wedge home. There was no conversation, but for the first time, there was a shared frequency of understanding. By midday, the stack was complete, a symmetrical wall of fuel against the coming winter. Genevieve wiped the sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist, her breathing steady and deep. She looked at Barnaby, who was leaning on his axe, his chest heaving. For a moment, his stoic mask fractured, and she saw a flicker of something raw in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, perhaps, or a deep-seated ache that matched her own. "You are strong," he breathed, the words heavy with a reluctant, grudging respect. "I have had to be," she answered, the simple statement holding the weight of 1,000 days spent under the gaze of those who feared what they could not control. Barnaby looked away, his jaw tightening. He turned and walked toward the barn, a structure leaning precariously against the slope of the ridge. He beckoned for her to follow, his stride long and purposeful. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of dried hay and old leather. He moved to a workbench cluttered with iron parts and scraps of hide, his hands hovering over them with an agonizing sort of tenderness. He picked up a small, intricately carved wooden figurine, his thumb tracing the smooth surface. He held it for a height before his fingers curled into fist, his knuckles turning white. Genevieve saw the pain in his expression, a ghost of a memory that seemed to hollow him out from the inside. "Who'd you make that for?" she asked, her voice soft, careful not to pierce the fragile silence he had built around him. Barnaby stiffened, the wood cracking under the pressure of his grip. He turned to face her, his eyes dark with a sudden, sharp defensive fire. "Quests have no place here. You were invited to stay for the labor, not for the history." He dropped the figurine into a pile of refuse and strode toward the back of the barn, disappearing into the shadows of the hayloft. Genevieve remained standing in the center of the room, the silence pressing in on her from all sides. She looked at the abandoned carving, wondering about the void that existed in this man, a void so large it had driven him to the edge of the world. She walked over and retrieved the wooden piece. It was a bird, small and delicate, its wings spread as if in flight. It was an anomaly in this place of heavy tools and rough, survivalist existence. It was a symbol of something he had tried to kill within him, something he still clutched even in his darkest moments of denial. She realized then that Barnaby was not merely living in the mountains to survive the elements. He was hiding from the person he had been before, from the man who had known how to carve beauty out of simple wood. The question of his name, and the trauma that had stripped him of his humanity, felt like a tether that would eventually drag them both in the depths if it remained anchored to the past. She tucked the carving into her pocket, the wood smooth and warm against her thigh. She would wait for the right moment to return it, to remind him that he was still capable of creating something other than distance. But as she exited the barn, she felt a sudden, cold breeze that carried the scent of wood smoke from the valley below. Someone was climbing the trail. She could see the faint, rising plume of a signal fire from the lower ridge. The world was coming to find them. Or perhaps, it was coming to find her. The scent of wood smoke was unmistakable, drifting upward on the thin, frigid mountain air like a jagged splinter of reality. Genevieve paused at the edge of the clearing, her hand instinctively going to the wooden bird in her pocket. The peace of the last few days evaporated, replaced by the familiar, cold hum of dread that had driven her from the valley in the first place. She turned back toward the cabin, her stride long and purposeful, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Barnaby stood on the porch, his back to the forest, his body rigid. He had clearly caught the scent. His nostrils flared. His eyes narrowed in slits as he stared toward the lower reaches of the mountain. He did not need to be told. He knew the scent was wrong. It was not the crisp, clean burn of seasoned pine or cedar, but a crid, biting stench of soft coal and damp wool. "They are near," Genevieve whispered as she stepped onto the porch. Her voice was steady, though every muscle in her body was coiled to spring. Barnaby did not look at her. They should not have found the path. The rock slide at the gorge made it impassable. "They have persistence," she replied, her eyes searching the dense tree line for movement. "And they have a reason to find me." Barnaby finally turned his gaze toward her, his expression unreadable, a wall of weathered skin and hardened resolve. "What did you steal? To make them track you this high?" The question was sharp, but it was not accusatory. It was clinical, a search for the nature of the threat. Genevieve looked at him, reeling that for all his gruffness, he was already calculating the defense of his perimeter. "I stole nothing," she said, her voice dropping into a low, controlled register. "I simply refused to belong to them. In the valley, my size, my strength, they were seen as property. I was an asset to be auctioned, a curiosity to be controlled. When I left, I took my freedom. That is the only thing they want to reclaim." Barnaby's jaw tightened. He shifted his weight, his massive frame radiating an aura of immovable protection. He did not offer empty promises or comfort. He simply moved toward the rack of tools near the door, his hand closing around the heavy, iron-headed splitting maul he had used to clear the wood earlier. It was not a weapon, but in his hands. It became one. "Go inside," he commanded, his voice a low rumble. "Stay away from the window. Do not make a sound until I return." "I am not a child to be hidden," she countered, stepping forward until she stood near his shoulder to shoulder with him. "If they have come for me, I should be the one to face them." Barnaby turned, his eyes locking on to hers with intensity that burned. "They are not looking for a fight with a woman. They are looking for a return on their investment. If they see you, they will bring more. If they see me, they will assume I am a squatter they can threaten." He reached down, his hand hovering near her shoulder for a fraction of a second, his fingers trembling with a restraint that felt like a seismic shift in the air between them. He did not touch her, but the proximity of his warmth made her breath catch. "Trust that I know this mountain better than they ever will," he breathed, the words barely audible. "Trust that I have not survived 8 years of solitude by being careless." He stepped off the porch, his movements fluid and silent as he vanished in the dense undergrowth. Genevieve stood frozen, the weight of the moment pressing down upon her. She had come here seeking a place to disappear, and now she was the anchor of a storm that threatened to drown the only man who had seen her as something more than a tool. She retreated inside, the silence of the cabin now heavy with apprehension. She paced the small room, her large frame making the space feel cramped, her movements restless. She found her at the window, peering through a small gap in the shutter. The forest was unnervingly quiet, the birds silenced by a presence moving through the timber below. She realized then that her presence had stripped him of the very thing he had sacrificed everything to preserve, his invisibility. Whether or not they succeeded in repelling the scouts, the sanctity of his life had been shattered. She felt a surge of guilt that threatened to overwhelm her. She had come to him a stranger, and now she was the catalyst for his undoing. She reached in her pocket and pulled out the wooden bird. The small, delicate thing, a sharp contrast to the brutal reality unfolding outside. She wondered what she would do if they caught him, or if he were forced to abandon the cabin to save her. The thought of him broken, his solitude invaded, sent a shudder through her. She realized, with a sudden, sinking clarity, that she no longer wanted to simply survive. She wanted to protect the quiet, stoic man who had granted her refuge when the world had offered only chains. The woods erupted with the sound of a startled jay. Some was moving closer. The sound of snapping branches crackled through the quiet forest like a pistol shot. Genevieve pulled her frame back from the window, pressing her spine against the cool, rough logs of the interior wall. Her heart hammered a frantic, uneven rhythm against her ribs. She was not afraid for hers. She was afraid for the man who had traded his peace to anchor her against the world. She reached for a heavy iron poker near the hearth, her grip white, knuckled and steady. Minutes crawled by, each second stretching an agonizing eternity. The cabin remained a tomb of silence until the heavy thud of boots sounded on the porch steps. Genevieve held her breath, every muscle in her body poised, ready to strike or to flee. The door groaned on its rusted hinges, swaying open just enough to reveal a sliver of the gray, overcast afternoon. Barnaby stepped inside. He did not look at her initially. He moved straight to the center of the room, his chest heaving, his face splattered with mud and flecks of bark. He looked like an elemental force that had been dragged through the underbrush. Yet he was still standing, his eyes burning with a cold, focus light. He closed the door behind him and slid the heavy iron bolt into place, the sound echoing like a final decision. "They are gone," he muttered, his voice raspy. Genevieve dropped the poker, the metal clattering against the stone floor. She stepped toward him, her concern override the distance he usually demanded. "Did they see you? Did they know you were there?" Barnaby leaned against the table, his massive frame shaking slightly with the adrenaline of the confrontation. He looked at her, and for the first time, he seemed to drop the armor of his stoic independence. "They are not looking for me. They're looking for a trail, a sign, anything." I led them toward the North Gorge. They will be hours before they realize the path is a dead end. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with the back of a hand that was thick with callus and dried blood. Genevieve caught his arm, her fingers sinking in the dense muscle of his bicep. She felt the heat radiating off him, a tangible reminder of the exertion he had poured in protecting her. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You do not know me. I am a stranger who appeared in your storm. Why risk everything you have built for a ghost?" Barnaby stared at her, his gaze lingering on her face with a raw intensity that made her flush. He shifted, pulling his arm away, but his eyes did not leave hers. "I have spent 8 years watching the snow fall and the trees grow. I have forgotten the sound of a human voice, and I have forgotten what it feels like to have a reason to move." He paused, his breath hitching. "You are not a ghost. You are the only person who has looked at this cabin and not seen a ruin. You are the first thing that has felt real in a long time." The air in the room felt thick, charged with the weight of his admission. Genevieve felt a vulnerable bloom in her chest. A dangerous, beautiful thing. She had spent a lifetime being a tool, an object, a burden. She had never been someone's reason for anything. She moved closer, closing the distance between them until the space they occupied felt impossibly small. "I cannot stay here and bring the world to your doorstep," she whispered, her eyes searching his for an answer he might not be able to give. "If they are coming for me, I should leave. I should head higher, into the deeper range. I can't let them destroy this." Barnaby shook his head, his motion sudden and sharp. He reached down, his hand hovering in the air before he finally settled it on her shoulder. His touch was heavy, solid, and searingly warm. "The mountain belongs to whoever can hold it. They do not know this place. I do not intend to let them take anything else from me." He moved past her then, his behavior shifting back into the routine of survival. He began to check the stores, his movements precise and methodical. Yet she noticed his eyes kept flickering toward the door. He was waiting. He was preparing for a shadow that he knew would eventually manifest. Genevieve watched him, the realization settling deep into her marrow. The fear of being hunted was no longer the primary pulse of her life. The new, terrifying, and exhilarating reality was the silent, deepening bond between them. She was no longer just a survivor hiding in the dark. She's a woman anchored to a giant. And he, in turn, was tethered to her. She walked to the hearth and began to stir the embers, adding fresh wood to the flames. The warmth of the fire filled the room, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to wrap around them like a protective cocoon. She looked at the wooden bird she had kept in her pocket, the symbol of his hidden heart. "You finish it," she said quietly, gesturing to the carving she had retrieved from the barn. "The bird. It deserves to fly." Barnaby froze. He turned to look at her, his expression unreadable, a mixture of pain and profound, hidden hope. He did not speak, but the way he looked at her told her that the silence between them had irrevocably changed. The shadow of the men in the woods was still lurking, but the light in the cabin felt stronger, more enduring. What was he truly running from? And was the price of his protection finally starting to outweigh his need for isolation? The following days were defined by a tense, heavy vigilance. Barnaby spent his hours patrolling the lower parameters, his presence in the forest a phantom, a silent guardian ensuring no trail led back to their door. Genevieve remained in the cabin, but she did not hide. She spent the time organizing the stores, mending the threadbare curtains, and reinforcing the weak points of the cabin structure with a heavy, deliberate strength. They existed in a state of suspended animation, the threat of the outside world lingering like smoke in the rafters. Whenever Barnaby returned, he was coated in the grime of the trail, his exhaustion visible in the way he slumped against the threshold. Genevieve would be waiting with a basin of warm water and a clean cloth. He would accept her ministrations with a stoic, wordless gratitude, his large, callous hands resting on his knees while she cleaned the mud from his boots or the pine needles from his hair. It was a ritual that deepened the quiet intimacy between them, a language of care that bypassed the need for explanation. "They have turned back," he murmured one evening, his voice a low rumble as he sat by the fire, his head bowed. "The weather is turned again. The pass will be closed for a month." Genevieve stopped, the cloth still in her hand. She looked at him, feeling a sudden, sharp pang of relief that was quickly tempered by the reality of their situation. "For now," she replied. "But they know the general direction. They will return when the snow melts." Barnaby looked up, his eyes searching hers in the flickering firelight. He seemed to be weighing something, his brow furrowed with the effort of communication. "Then we prepare. I have been alone here for 8 years. Genevieve. I have built this place for a man who did not want to be found. But a mountain is not a prison. It is a refuge. He reached out, his hand covering hers. His skin was rough, a landscape of scars and calluses. Yet his touch was profoundly gentle. The contact sent a jolt of heat through her, a stark reminder of the physical magnitude of them both. They were two giants, isolated from a world that had no room for their strength. Yet here, in this small space, they were whole. Why 8 years? She asked, the question slipping out before she could stop it. What happened that made you turn your back on everything? Barnaby stiffened, his fingers tightening on hers for a fleeting second before he pulled away. He stood and walked to the window, his broad back a wall of tension. I was a builder in the valley, he began, his voice strained, as if the words were being dragged from him against his will. I built bridges. I thought that if I could connect people, I could bridge the gaps between them. I was wrong. I built a bridge that could not hold the weight of greed. When it collapsed, people died. I was the one who signed the plan. I was the one who swore it was safe. The confession hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. Genevieve felt the weight of his grief, a sorrow so immense it had driven him to the literal edge of the world. She understood then why he was so protective, why he was so slow to trust, and why he had looked at her with such suspicion when she first arrived. He was a man defined by the belief that his presence was a catalyst for destruction. That was not your burden alone, she whispered, rising to join him at the window. The world is not as fragile as you fear, and you're not responsible for the sins of those who did not listen to your warnings. He turned to look at her, his expression raw, exposed. I signed the papers. Genevieve. I let them rush the work. I chose to be a part of it, even when I knew better. I have spent every day since then wondering if I have the right to exist at all, let alone to protect someone else. Genevieve reached out, her hand finding the scent of his chest, right over his heart. She felt the steady, powerful thrum of his life beneath her palm. You saved me, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. You carried me through a storm that would have ended me. You chose to be a protector, not a builder of bridges. That has to count for something. Barnaby looked down at her hand, his eyes softening. He did not pull away. For a moment. The silence in the cabin was not oppressive, it was sacred. They were two souls who had been broken by a world that demanded too much of them, finding solace in the recognition of their own endurance. He leaned down, his forehead coming to rest against hers. It was a gesture of profound vulnerability, a surrender of his long-held solitude. I do not know how to be anything else but the man who lives on the mountain, he confessed, his voice barely audible. Then be that man, she replied, a faint smile touching her lips. But be him with me. The fire crackled, casting a warm, amber glow across his features. Outside, the wind began to rise again, signaling the return of the winter. But inside, the chill had vanished. They were connected by the shared history of their burdens, a tether that felt stronger than any steel bridge he had ever designed. As the night deepened, the question remained, could they truly forge a life in this isolation? Or would the shadows of their pasts find a way to tear down the walls they had built? The winter descended with a ferocity that turned the world into a monochromatic nightmare of ice and gale-force wind. For days, the cabin trembled under the assault, the logs groaning like ancient creatures in pain. Yet, within those walls, a strange, quiet alchemy was taking place. The distance between Genevieve and Barnaby, once a vast canyon of suspicion and caution, had narrowed to a fragile bridge of shared breath and constant, lingering proximity. One afternoon, while Barnaby labored to clear a secondary tunnel through the drifts to the woodpile, his foot slipped on a hidden patch of black ice. It was a small mistake, the kind that usually meant nothing to a man of his size. But the angle was cruel. He went down with a sickening thud. His leg twisted beneath the heavy drift. Genevieve, watching from the doorway, did not hesitate. She crossed the frozen clearing in 3 long, powerful strides, her hands gripping him before he could even attempt to rise. "Do not move," she ordered, her voice cutting through the wind. She hauled him up with a strength that rivaled his own, her arm a steel band around his waist. When they reached the warmth of the cabin, she helped him on the bench, her fingers working with a precision born of years of nursing her own injuries. As she peeled back the heavy buckskin his pant leg, she saw the swelling, the angry bruise already darkening his corded calf. "It is broken," he muttered, his jaw tight with suppressed agony. "It is a fracture," she corrected, her touch feather, light despite the magnitude of her grip. "But you will not be on it for a long time." As she bound the injury with strips of clean linen, the air in the room grew thick with a new, unsettled tension. This was the moment of the shift. Barnaby, the man who had been the protector, the silent guardian of the mountain, was now the one who required care. He looked at her, his eyes searching, his usual cynicism replaced by a raw, naked vulnerability that hit her harder than any confession could have. "You should go," he rasped, his voice strained. "The supplies are in the cellar. You can survive the winter alone." "I am dead weight now." Genevieve stopped, her hands resting firmly on his knee. She looked him directly in the eyes, her expression fierce. "Do not speak of yourself that way. You gave me safety when I had none. You think I would walk away now?" Barnaby looked away, his chest heaving. "I have built my life on the belief that I must be the one to hold the line. If I cannot stand, I cannot protect. That is the truth I have lived by for 8 years." "Then you have been living a lie," she said, her voice soft but absolute. "Protection is not about being the only one standing. It is about knowing who will stand beside you when you fall." She stood up and moved to the shelf, returning with a sharp knife and a piece of wood. She sat across from him, her posture mirroring his, and began to whittle, her movements as rhythmic and steady as his own used to be. It was the carving he had abandoned, the small, wooden bird. She was finishing it for him, returning his craft with her own patient hands. Barnaby watched her, his breath catching as he realized what she was doing. The silence stretched, no longer filled with the weight of his guilt, but with the quiet, persistent pulse of their connection. For the first time, he did not look at the door with dread. He looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the slow, terrifying dawn of a realization that he did not have to carry his world alone. "I have spent so long fearing that if I let anyone close, I would ruin them," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "I thought this mountain was my penance, but perhaps it was just a cage." Genevieve reached out, taking his large, scarred hand in hers. His fingers curled around her palm, a desperate, anchoring grip. The revelation was not that they had been found, or that the world was still waiting, but that they had found each other. The internal loop that had driven him to isolation, the conviction that he was a destroyer, was beginning to break. She leaned in, their foreheads resting against one another, their breathing synchronizing in the dim light of the cabin. She felt his fear, not of the storm, but of the sudden, overwhelmed warmth of being known. It was a profound shift in the landscape of their lives. They were no longer two souls drifting in the wilderness. They were becoming something singular, something resilient. But as the wind howled a warning against the walls, Genevieve felt a sudden, sharp tremor in his hand. He was not just healing from a broken leg, he was healing from a broken sense of self. The question now was not whether they could survive the winter, but whether they were strong enough to survive the vulnerability of being loved. Was he finally ready to let go of the ghost he had fed for 8 long years? The cabin became a world unto self, governed by the rhythm of healing. With Barnaby confined to the bench, the physical balance of their lives shifted in ways neither had anticipated. Genevieve became the primary provider, venturing in the biting cold to gather firewood, tending the traps, and managing the hearth. She moved with a silent, graceful power, her giant frame filling the space with efficiency that Barnaby watched with a mixture of awe and zoning. Quiet adoration. He was no longer the mountain's silent ghost. He was a man finding his way back to the living. As the swell in his legs subsided, he began to use his upper body strength to navigate, dragging him across the floorboards with a determination that mirrored the tenacity of a tree clinging to a cliffside. One evening, as the fire cast long, dancing shadows across the logs, Genevieve sat beside him, the finished wooden bird resting in her palm. She placed it into his large, rough hand. The movement was slow, deliberate. His fingers closed around the carving, his touch lingering on the delicate curve of the wings she had shaped. "You did not have to finish it," he whispered, his voice resonating with a depth she had not heard before. "It belongs to you," she replied. Her eyes locked onto his. "It is a part of who you are. I could not let you leave it in the dust." Barnaby looked at the bird, then up at her. The stoic mask he had worn for 8 years had thinned, revealing a man of profound sensitivity and capacity for affection. He reached out, his hand coming to rest against her cheek. His thumb brushed over her skin, his touch so light it felt like a brush of winter air. Yet it held the weight of a lifetime of suppressed longing. "I've been afraid of this for so long," he confessed, the admission heavy in the air. "I thought if I allowed myself to feel, I would only be inviting the end of everything I held dear. And yet, here we are," Genevieve countered softly. "The world has not ended. We are still here." She leaned into his touch, a sigh escaping her lips. For the first time, she felt the terrifying, beautiful safety of being truly seen. She was not a tool or a curiosity to him. She was the partner who had stood by him when his strength failed. The weight of their shared grief, his for the lives lost through his hubris, hers for the dignity stripped from her by those who saw. Only her size began to feel less like a mountain they were forced to climb and more like a scar that had finally begun to knit together. They were two halves of a whole, finding in their isolation a sanctuary that the wider world had denied them. "I have been a fool," Barnaby murmured, his eyes searching hers with a desperate intensity. "I thought isolation was protection, but it was only a slower, colder form of death." "We are not dead yet," she said, her voice a promise. He leaned forward, his forehead pressing against hers. The silence in the room was not empty. It was filled with the promise of a future that, until now, had seemed impossible. He dropped his guard completely, allowing her to see the full, raw scope of his vulnerability. It was an act of courage greater than any physical feat he had ever performed. Outside, the storm finally began to break. The wind died down to a low, mournful whistle, and the first true silence of the winter descended upon the ridge. It was as if the mountain itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what these two survivors would do now that the walls of their sanctuary had been breached by their own hearts. As they sat there, the firelight reflecting in their eyes. Genevieve felt a sudden, sharp ache of longing. She realized that while they had found a momentary peace, the shadow of the world still loomed below. Their connection was a fragile bloom in a frozen landscape, and they had yet to be truly tested. Would the strength they had found in each other be enough to keep them safe when the spring thaws finally opened the paths to the valley? The thaw began with a sound that haunted the silence of the mountains, the rhythmic, wet drip of melting ice against the cabin eaves. It was a herald of inevitable change. Barnaby had recovered enough to stand on his own, his legs stiff but functional. Yet he moved with a newfound caution. He no longer paced the cabin with the restless, caged energy of a man obsessed with his perimeter. Instead, he spent his time watching Genevieve, his gaze tracking her movements with a lingering, soft intensity that made the small cabin feel as vast and intimate as a cathedral. One afternoon, while the sun finally broke through the heavy, gray ceiling of winter, they stepped on the porch together. The world was a chaotic tapestry of melting slush and revealing earth. Genevieve drew in a deep breath, the air tasting of damp pine and the promise of new life. She looked at Barnaby, who stood beside her, his shoulders broad and steady, the mountain no longer his prison, but his home. "The trail will be clear within the week," she said, her voice devoid of the dread she once felt. Barnaby did not look at the trail. He looked at the valley below, his expression serene. "Let them come. I have learned that the strength to hold a line is not found in the fear of who approaches, but in the certainty of who stands beside you." A genuine, soft laugh bubbled up in Genevieve's throat, a sound so rare it startled them both. She reached out, taking his hand, and he entwined his fingers with hers, his grip firm and reassuring. In that moment of shared joy, the last of the winter's ice seemed to shatter within them. They were not just survivors. They were two people who had earned their right to a future. They spent the day in the garden, a place Barnaby had tended for years with a quiet, hidden devotion. He showed her the emerging shoots of spring, the hardy roots that had survived beneath the frost. Genevieve realized that he had been preparing for this life all along, even when he believed he was only waiting for the end. "I have something to show you," he said, his voice hesitant. He led her to a small, hidden overlook on the far side of the ridge, a place where the trees tend to reveal a breathtaking panorama of the high peaks. In the center of the clearing stood a partially finished structure, a small cabin built with more care than the one they inhabited. It was meant for someone else, or perhaps for a life he had never dared to imagine. It was a home, not a fortress. "I built this when I first arrived," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the structure. "I told myself it was for a future I would never have. I told myself it was just to keep my hands busy, to make sure I did not forget how to build something that would not collapse." Genevieve walked into space, the scent of fresh cut cedar filling her senses. It was open, filled with light, and designed for a life that allowed for connection. She looked at him, her heart swelling with a profound, aching gratitude. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "It is waiting," he replied, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register. He moved closer, the space between them charged with a sudden, electric vulnerability. He was no longer the stoic protector, nor was she the weary survivor. They were two people standing in the threshold of a life they had forged together out of the wreckage of their pasts. He reached out, his hand cupping her face, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw with a reverence that took her breath away. "I do not know what tomorrow brings, Genevieve. I only know that I do not want to see it without you." She leaned into his hand, her eyes closing as she savored the sensation of being cherished. "Then we will face it together." The air was still, save for the distant cry of a hawk circling the peaks. They were miles from the world that had tried to claim them. Yet they were closer to humanity than they had ever been. The lesson was settling into their bones. They were not defined by the pain that had brought them to the mountain, but by the resilience they had found in each other. However, as the sun began to dip behind the peaks, casting long, encroaching shadows, Barnaby's gaze flickered back toward the trail. He had not forgotten the secrets of the mountain, and there was one final detail he had kept hidden. A secret regarding the path itself that he had yet to reveal. What did he know about the mountain path that he had been too afraid to tell her? And would it change everything they had just built? The transition from winter to spring was not the gentle rebirth Genevieve had imagined. Instead, the melting snow turned the mountainside into treacherous, shifting landscape of mud and rushing torrents. With the trails beginning to clear, the isolation that had served as their greatest protection was rapidly dissolving. Barnaby moved with a renewed, restless energy, his attention constantly drawn toward the lower reaches of the mountain. He stood on the porch, his eyes tracing the jagged line where the path emerged from the dense tree line. "The valley folk will be coming soon," he muttered, his voice taut. "The spring melt brings the hunters and the traders. They be looking for a way through to the northern passes." Genevieve joined him, her hand resting on his forearm. She could feel the hard, coiled tension in his muscles. "We are ready, Barnaby. We have made this place our own." He turned to her, his expression a mix of resolve and deep-seated apprehension. "The reason the mountain is voided, Genevieve, it is not just the steepness or the weather. There is a section of the path, the narrow way, that has been rigged with a series of rock traps. I set them when I first arrived, to assure no one would stumble upon this place by accident." Genevieve felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool spring air. "You trapped the mountain?" "I was a builder," he said, his tone flat. "I knew how to create instability as easily as I knew how to create strength. If those traps are triggered, the entire ridge could shift. I have to go down and deactivate them before anyone reaches the dangerous section. It cannot risk someone's life, even if they are searching for me." "I will go with you," she stated, her voice firm. "No," he said, his refusal immediate and absolute. "The path is unstable. If I am caught in a slide, I need you here, where you are safe. You must wait for me. If I am not back by dusk, you must take the eastern route. It leads away from the valley, deeper into the range." "I am not leaving you," she insisted, stepping into his personal space, her eyes challenging his. "We have spent the winter building a life. Barnaby, I am not about to watch you walk into a potential grave while I sit here waiting for a ghost." Barnaby sighed, the sound heavy and tired. He reached out, his hands framing her face, his gaze searching hers with intensity that burned. "You are my life, Genevieve. The thought of losing you because of my own past, because of the traps I set in my own cowardice, is a weight I cannot bear." "Then do not go alone," she countered. "We are giants, Barnaby. We are stronger than the mountain. We can disobey them together." He looked at her for a long, agonizing moment, then gave a slow, reluctant nod. They moved with a synchronous urgency, gathering the tools they needed. As they descended the slope, the mountain seemed to groan under their feet, the earth still soft and shifting from the thaw. The atmosphere was thick with the threat of movement, the very ground they walked upon feeling like a living, breathing entity that was watching their every step. The deeper they went, the more the forest felt like a place of secrets. Genevieve saw the marks Barnaby had made notched trees, Hidden tripwires he had once intended to be lethal, now neutralized by the decay of time. It was a sobering look at the man he had been, a man so consumed by the need for silence that he had been willing to silence the world around him. They reached the narrow way, a precarious ledge that hung over a steep, rocky ravine. The silence here was absolute, save for the rush of water far below. Barnaby knelt at the edge of the path, his hands working with the iron rods he had set years ago. It was a delicate, dangerous operation. One slip, one wrong movement, and the entire ledge could collapse. Genevieve stood guard, her eyes scanning the forest for any sign of movement from below. She felt the vulnerability of their position, the terrifying realization that their sanctuary was built on a foundation of his self-imposed war against the world. Almost there, Barnaby whispered, his voice strained as he pulled the final pin. A sudden, sharp crack echoed through the ravine. The ground beneath them shuddered, a warning tremor that sent pebbles skittering into the void. Barnaby lunged for her, his massive arms wrapping around her in a desperate, protective embrace as they scrambled back toward the solid bedrock. The path behind them gave way with a roar, a cascade of stone and earth tumbling down in the ravine. They collapsed against the mountain face, their breath coming in ragged gasps. The silence that followed was deafening. Barnaby pulled back, his hand searching her face, his eyes wide with terror. "I should never have let you come," he breathed, his voice broken. "We are alive," she reminded him, her voice a steady anchor in the aftermath. But as they looked down, they realized the path was completely severed. They were trapped on the wrong side of the collapse, and the sound of the slide would surely draw whoever was searching for them. The dust of the collapse hung in the air like a thick, gray shroud, coating their hair and skin. Genevieve coughed, her lungs burning, and pushed hers up from the narrow ledge. Below them, the path had vanished, leaving a jagged, vertical scar in the mountainside that dropped into a terrifying abyss. They were cut off from the easy way back to the cabin, but the sound of the slide, a thunderous roar that had surely echoed for miles, was a beacon. "We have to move," Barnaby rasped, his voice tight with controlled panic. He gripped her hand, his palms sweating, his eyes scanning the steep, treacherous slope above them. "Whoever's tracking us will be here with the hour. We can't go down, and we cannot stay here." "The ridge," Genevieve suggested, her voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding her veins. "If we can reach the high trail, we can circle back to the west side. It is difficult, but we are capable." Barnaby looked at her, his expression softening for a height. He saw not a fragile woman to be protected, but a partner who was as much a part of this mountain as he was. "You are right. We climb." They began the ascent. The terrain was unforgiving, a mix of loose shale and stubborn, frozen earth that crumbled under their weight. They moved with a desperate, rhythmic intensity. Whenever a ledge proved too steep, Barnaby would lock his fingers, creating a step for Genevieve, and she would reach down to haul him up after her. Their strength combined into singular, unstoppable force. As they crested the ridge, the sun began to dip, casting long, bruised shadows across the valley. From their vantage point, they saw the tiny, dark shapes of men moving along the lower trail, their voices faint but sharp against the biting wind. The hunters had heard the slide. They were converging on the gorge. "They are looking for a sign of struggle," Barnaby whispered, his hand resting on the hilt of his belt knife. "If they find the path gone, they will assume we are dead or trapped, or they will know we are still here." "Somewhere above them," Genevieve countered. Her eyes narrowed. She looked at the cabin, visible as a tiny speck against the mount slope. If they reached it, they could hold the entrance, but they would be trapped against the cliff. If they kept moving, they could disappear into the high range, but they would be leaving their home behind. "We cannot go back," Barnaby said, reading her thoughts. "If we return to the cabin, we are cornered. If we move into the high range, we are ghosts again." Genevieve felt a sharp, hollow ache in her chest. For months, she had fought for the right to belong somewhere, to have a roof and a fire and a man who looked at her with love instead of expectation. To abandon that now, to return to the wild, felt like a defeat. "Is this our life?" she asked, her voice tight. "Always running? Always hiding?" Barnaby stopped. He turned to face her, the wind whipping his hair across his brow. "No, that was my life. That is not who we are anymore." He pulled her in the shelter of a rock outcropping. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the wooden bird she had helped him finish. He held it up, the small, carved wings catching the fading light. "I built this to remind me that flight is possible, even for those of us who have lived in the dirt. We do not need the cabin to be us. We are the refuge." Genevieve felt a surge of warmth that defied the encroaching night. She took his hand, her own fingers tracing the hard, callow skin of his palm. "Then we do not hide. We choose." "What are you saying?" he asked. "We do not return to the cabin, and we do not vanish," she replied, her eyes burning with a sudden, fierce resolve. "We find a way to make them look the other way. We lead them away from the home we built, and we force them to stop searching." Barnaby's eyes widened, a slow, grim smile spreading across his bearded face. "You mean to lead them toward the southern pass? It is a 3-day trek, and the winter snows are still deep in the valleys. We are the only ones who can survive it," she said. "If we show them that the mountain is impassable, they will stop. They will go back to valley and leave us in peace." They stood on the edge of the world, two giants against the encroaching darkness. They were preparing to abandon the only home they had known, not out of fear, but out of the deliberate, calculated sacrifice to preserve their future. As they turned their backs on the cabin and began the arduous trek in the high, untamed peaks, Genevieve felt the weight of her choice. They were leaving behind the safety of walls and the comfort of the hearth. What would they find in the deep, uncharted silence of the high range? And would they be able to return to the life they had started? Or had they just walked away from it forever? The high range was a realm of indifferent stone and razor-edged wind, a place where the air grew thin enough to make the lungs ache with every breath. For 2 days, they pushed upward, their massive frames straining against the incline, their bodies' heat radiating furnaces in the biting cold. They traveled light, carrying only the barest essentials for survival, their bond the only shelter they possessed against the vast, empty sky. Every step was a battle of will. Genevieve felt the familiar pull of her muscles, the way her body thrived on the exertion. Yet the exhaustion began to gnaw at her. She watched Barnaby, who led the way with a grim, rhythmic precision. He did not falter. Though she saw the way his leg, the one so recently shattered, trembled when he misstepped on a patch of scree. He was pushing past the limits of his own healing, driven by a singular, assuming need to keep her safe. "We rest here," he muttered as the light began to fade, his voice raspy from the altitude. They huddled in the lee of a granite monolith, the only barrier between them and the howling. Empty, dark. Genevieve crawled close to him, pressing her back against his chest. His arms, thick and corded with muscle, wrapped around her, pulling her in the core of his warmth. in the silence of the high peaks. The lack of walls was replaced by the overwhelming, terrifying expanse of the stars. "Do you regret it?" he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "The home we left behind?" Genevieve looked out at the jagged horizon, where the mountains bled in the ink-black void of the night. She thought of the cabin, the garden, the wooden bird resting in his pocket. "I regret that we had to leave it," she answered honestly. "But I do not regret that we chose this. We are proving to ourselves that we are not defined by a place. We are defined by what we choose to protect." Barnaby's grip tightened, his hand sliding over her shoulder to rest against her heart. "I have spent years thinking I was a destroyer," he confessed, his voice barely audible over the wind. "I thought that everything I touch would eventually collapse. But I have realized that with you, I am not destroying. I am enduring." "We are more than enduring," she whispered, turning in his arms to face him. The moonlight cast his features in sharp relief, highlighting the rugged strength of his face and the profound, quiet tenderness in his eyes. He leaned down, and when his lips met hers, the world below, the hunters, the valley, the threats of the past faded into nothingness. It was a kiss of profound, desperate acknowledgement. It was the culmination of their winter together, a silent pact that they were no longer two halves, but a single, iron-willed soul. They slept in snatches, their proximity the only thing keeping the encroaching hypothermia at bay. In the morning, they moved again, their target the treacherous southern pass that led to the distant, uninhabited territories. They were leaving the known world behind, a sacrifice that felt both like a loss and a liberation. As they reached the sum of the pass, they looked back, far below, barely visible to the naked eye, were the tiny, flickering lights of the search party, still clustered near the gorge where the slide had occurred. They were looking for bodies, for signs of failure. They had no idea that the two they sought were standing on the roof of the world, choosing a path that led not to death, but to a life they had authored them. "They never find us here," Barnaby said, his voice laced with a grim, final satisfaction. "Then let them turn back," she replied. But as the wind gusted, tearing at their clothes, Genevieve noticed a dark, unnatural plume of smoke rising from the direction of the cabin. A spark, or a deliberate act of spite, had set the dry timber of their sanctuary ablaze. The cabin was gone. The home they had built. The garden. The future they had envisioned in that specific place. It was being reclaimed by the mountain in a column of fire. Barnaby watched the smoke with a stony, unreadable expression. He did not cry out. He did not rage. He simply stood there, his hand gripping hers with a force that threatened to break bones. "They've taken the house," he said, his voice flat. "But they have not taken us." Genevieve looked at him, realizing the true test was only just beginning. They were truly alone now, with no shelter, no history to lean on, and the long, difficult path of the south ahead of them. Could they survive the harsh reality of the wilderness? Or would the loss of their home force them to realize that their bond was not as strong as they had hoped? The sight of the burning cabin was a wound that cut deep. The orange glow against the twilight a mockery of the warmth they had shared. For a long, suffocating minute, neither of them spoke. The wind carried the faint, bitter scent of charred pine, a smell that felt like the final closing of a door. Genevieve watched the fire, her chest aching with a grief that felt heavy, physical, and absolute. She had fought for that space. She had poured her strength in the logs, the garden, and the simple, daily rituals that had made them a family. "They destroyed it," she whispered. the words trembling in the freezing air. Barnaby did not turn away. He kept his eyes fixed on the distant pyre, his posture rigid. They could not find us, so they chose to burn what we love. It is the coward's way. He turned to her then, and for first time in their journey, she saw a shadow of the man who had lived in total, bitter isolation. The loss of the cabin had brought back the specter of his past, the memory of bridges collapsing on the weight of others' greed. "Barnaby," she said, her voice sharp, cutting through his descent into darkness. She grabbed his shoulders, her fingers digging into the heavy, solid muscle of his arms. "Do not look at the smoke. Look at me." He blinked, the harshness in his eyes softening as he focused on her face. The firelight reflecting off the distant peaks did not matter anymore. What mattered was the heat of the woman standing before him, the unwavering strength in her grip, and the fierce, protective light in her eyes. "It was just wood stone," he murmured, his voice thick. "It was our beginning," she countered, her gaze unwavering. "But it is not our end. We are still standing. We're still here." He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty the last of the bitterness from his lungs. He reached up, covering her hands with his own, and pulled her into his chest. They stood there on the desolate summit, two titans of muscle and bone, anchoring each other against the void. "We must keep moving," he said, his tone shifting from despair to grim. "Iron, willed necessity. The southern pass will be brutal this time of night. We cannot stay exposed." They descended in the shadow of the southern range. The trek became a blurred nightmare of exhaustion, their movements fueled by nothing but the desperate need to stay alive. They scrammed over frozen scree, waded through wastes, deep drifts that sapped their heat, and navigated by the dim, silver light of the moon. They did not talk. They did not need to. They moved in perfect, rhythmic alignment, a single entity carved out of the mountainous self. By the time they reached a natural cavern, a hollowed-out scar in the side of a granite cliff, they were both nearing the edge of their endurance. They collapsed into the darkness, the silence of the cave a heavy, suffocating weight. Genevieve fumbled for her flint, her hand shaking so violently she could barely strike a spark. Barnaby reached down, his hand steadying hers. He did not speak. He simply struck the steel, a shower of sparks illuminating the hollow for a fleeting, beautiful second before the dry tinder caught. The flames grew, casting a flickering, golden light that warmed the damp rock. They sat close, their bodies pressed together for warmth, the firelight catching the hollows of their cheeks and the depth of their exhaustion. Genevieve saw the way he looked at her, a gaze that carried no hunger, no expectation, only a profound, aching gratitude. "We have lost everything," he breathed, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. "We have lost a shelter," she corrected, leaning in him until their foreheads rested together. "We have not lost each other. That is the only thing that ever truly belonged to us." He let out a ragged, broken sound, half sob, half laugh, and pulled her tight. He pressed his face into the hollow of her neck, his beard rough against her skin, his heart hammering against her own. She felt the depth of his surrender, the moment he finally, completely, let go of the man he had been before her. He was no longer the mountain hermit, the broken builder, the protector of a ruined past. He was simply a man who loved, and who was loved in return. But as the night wore on, a distant sound echoed through the canyon. It was not the wind. It was the rhythmic, metallic clang of iron on stone, a sound that, in the high, uninhabited ranges, could only belong to those who were still hunting. The question of whether their sacrifice had been enough to deter their pursuers hung in the air. A cold, sharp blade who was still following them. And how far would they go to finish what they had started? The metallic clanging echoed again. A sharp, rhythmic dissonance that had no place in the primal symphony of the high range. Barnaby stood, his movement swift and silent, his hand resting on the small knife at his belt. He did not look at the fire. He looked at the entrance of the cave. His body tensed, the massive muscles of his back bunching under his shirt. Genevieve rose behind him, her presence as solid as the granite walls that sheltered them. She did not ask if he had heard it. She simply picked up a heavy, jagged piece of limestone, the weight of it familiar and reassuring in her grip. "They are tracking us by the smoke," Barnaby whispered, his voice a low, gravelly vibration. "The cabin fire drew them to the ridge, and now they're following our trail across the pass. They have no right to this range," she said, her voice hard with a resolve that felt like iron. "This is not the valley. They can't survive here as we can." Barnaby looked back at her, his eyes dark with a sudden, sharp realization. They are not just hunters. They are professionals. Men sent from the valley to ensure the property is returned or silenced. The truth of his words hung in the cold, thin air. Genevieve felt a shiver that had nothing to do with the temperature. She had spent a lifetime feeling like an object of trade, but she had never fully grasped that the people who controlled her life viewed her existence as a commodity that required retrieval. The revelation was not a shock, it was the final, brutal confirmation of everything she had tried to leave behind. "Then we end this," she said, her voice dropping into register of cold, absolute calm. "We do not lead them further into the range. We lead them into the storm." She pointed toward the north face, where the clouds were banking in a thick, bruised well of violet and brack. A high-altitude gale was brewing, a tempest that would turn the pass into a graveyard for those not born to the mountain. "If we move toward the Widow's Peak, we can force them in the exposure," Barnaby said, his eyes tracking the horizon. "It is a path I never intended to walk again. It is where once nearly lost my own life. The night I first stumbled on this mountain." Genevieve saw the sudden, stark terror in his eyes, not for himself, but for the memory of the trauma that had haunted him for 8 years. He'd never spoken of the night he arrived, of the reason he was so broken when he first stepped in the cold. "Tell me," she said, stepping into his space, her hands finding his face. He leaned into her touch, his eyes closing. "I did not just walk away from the bridge. Genevieve. I was sent away. I was chased. I was branded a criminal by the men who had profited from the tragedy, blamed for the collapse to cover their own greed. I fled in the storm because it was the only way to escape a false gallows." The core loop of his isolation finally snapped. He was not a destroyer who had failed. He was a man who had been framed by the very people who now sought to hunt her. The realization was a lightning strike. They were both victims of the same corruption, the same predatory hunger that sought to crush anything that did not serve its purpose. "Then we not just survive," she said, her eyes burning. "We bear witness. We stop running. And we make them face the reality of what they have done. The danger is too great," he warned, his voice straining. "If we confront them, there is no guarantee we come out of the peak whole." "We're already whole," she reminded him, pressing her forehead against his. "We have each other. We have the truth. And we have the mountain. That is more than they will ever possess." He stared at her, his breathing leveling out until it matched the slow, steady rhythm of her own. The fear of his past, the haunting weight of his 8-year exile. finally began to dissolve. He wasn't a criminal, and she wasn't a commodity. They were simply two giants who had survived the worst of humanity, and they were ready to reclaim their right to exist. He took her hand, his grip firm, unwavering. They turned toward the mouth of the cave, where the wind began to howl a song of coming judgment. The metallic clanging grew louder, closer. The hunters, oblivious to the fact that they were no longer tracking victims, but stalking a storm as they stepped out in the biting gale. The final truth remained. They were about to face a confrontation that would either destroy them or carve their freedom into the very stone of the peaks. The gale on the heights of Widow's Peak was not a wind. It was a physical blow, a wall of frozen air that threatened to peel the skin from their bones. Genevieve and Barnaby moved as one, their massive frames leaning in the tempest, their steps heavy and deliberate. Behind them, the sounds of the pursuit had grown erratic, the hunters struggling to maintain their footing in the worsening conditions. The mountain was taking its toll, the sheer unforgiving nature of the high range punishing those who did not belong to heights. They reached the summit, a narrow, windswept ridge that dropped away into terrifying nothingness on either side. It was here that Barnaby had arrived 8 years ago, shattered and fleeing, and it was here that he would choose to stand. He turned to face the way they had come, his hand gripping the cold, unyielding rock. Genevieve stood beside him, her silhouette a mirror of his own. They were two giants against the dying light, their presence commanding the mountain itself. The hunters peered through the swirl-white curtain, 3 men, rugged and heavily armed, their faces pinched with cold and frustration. They stopped dead when they saw the figures standing at the summit. In the dim, ghostly light, Genevieve and Barnaby looked not like people, but like statues carved from the mountain's own heart. "Stop," Barnaby's voice roared, carrying over the wind with the authority of a landslide. It was not a plea, it was a final, immutable command. "This path ends here. You will go back, or you will stay on this mountain forever." One of the men sneered, lifting a rifle, but his hands were shaking violently from the cold. He looked at the sheer size of the two figures before him, the way they stood unshaken by the hurricane-force gusts, and the malice in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden, creeping dread. They were not chasing people. They were chasing something that belonged to the wind and the stone. "You've no claim to us," Genevieve called out, her voice clear and resonant. "The debt you think you are collecting does not exist. We have paid for our lives with the years you stole from us." The leader of the group hesitated, glancing toward the drop off behind the pair, then back at the relentless, frozen wall of the high range ahead. He saw the cold, unwavering resolve in their eyes, a strength that no amount of lead or greed could overcome. He looked at his companions, their faces pale, their spirits broken by the altitude and the sheer, overwhelming presence of the two giants who blocked their path. With a muttered curse, the leader lowered his rifle. He turned, signaling his men to retreat. They did not look back. They scrambled away, descending toward the lower slopes as if fleeing from demons. The mountain had spoken, and they had listened. Barnaby and Genevieve remained on the summit as the storm began to abate, the clouds breaking to reveal a vast, star-strewn sky. The silence that returned was not the empty, oppressive silence of their past, it was the sacred, profound stillness of victory. Barnaby turned to her, his face weathered by the wind, his eyes shining with a light that had nothing to do with the stars. He reached down, pulling her into his arms, and held her with a desperation that slowly eased into gentle, absolute peace. "We are free," he whispered against her hair. "We are home," she replied. resting her head against his shoulder, feeling the steady, powerful rhythm of his heart beneath her own. They stayed there until the dawn painted the peaks in gold and rose. A new day beginning on a mountain that now truly belonged to them. They were not the same people who had met in the blizzard. They were forged by the fire of their loss and the strength of their endurance. They would build again, not because they were forced to, but because they had finally claimed the right to create. The valley would continue its march, and the world would continue its demands. But up here, in the high, clean air, they had found something that could never be reclaimed or destroyed. They had found the truth of their own worth as they began their long, steady descent toward a sheltered valley they had spotted from the summit, a place with timber, water, and earth waiting to be turned. The weight of their pasts fell away like the winter snow. They walked hand in hand, their footprints the only mark on the pristine, untouched white, starting a life that was theirs alone. The loop of their survival had ended, and the long, slow, beautiful rhythm of their future had finally begun. They were two giants who had walked out of the shadow and into the light, and for the first time, they were truly whole. This is a work of fiction. Characters, places, and events are products of the author's imagination or are used fictitiously. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, or actual events is entirely coincidental.